did Marty have a new vision for the NBER, or did things just kind of happen as they evolved? And the answer is unquestionably he did have a vision, right? Because it turns out I've discovered that that the NBER used to have an annual report that was published each year. It was one of the things that Marty phased out in his new regime. But in the 1977 annual report, okay, Marty wrote a message to the board and to the constituency of the NBER, okay, which completely sums up what happened in the next 30 years. Okay, he said, okay, if I had to summarize in a single word what I regard as the Bureau's potential contribution, that word would be interaction. The Bureau can provide a framework in which to achieve research goals that individual scholars could not achieve alone or through other existing organizations, right? And that is exactly what happened over the course of Marty's tenure as NBER president, right? He delivered on exactly what he described that he was going to do. So Marty hit the ground running, okay, probably more so than anybody expected when he took the job. When he arrived, the NBER was publishing 2 journals a year. Some of you may have someplace on your shelves a copy of the vintage Annals of Economic and Social Measurement. The other one was called the Explorations in Economic Research. Marty closed them both. Okay. The NBER had offices in Washington, New York, New Haven, Cambridge, and Palo Alto. I guess the way to describe it is Marty contributed to the dynamism of the American labor market by closing the Washington and the New Haven office and laying off most of the staff in New York. And what he did was to refocus on the pure research component with an emphasis on building networks that would pull together researchers under the NBER umbrella. Marty even sold a data banking operation that was being headquartered here in Cambridge to Citibank and gave them the opportunity to collect a set of macro time series that the NBER at that point was trying to assemble. So Marty, within the first 2 years, okay, actually launched what really was the framework for the NBER that evolved in the next couple of decades. And there are basically 4 things that he did. Okay. The first was he created research programs that were larger than a single researcher and that were going to be designed to tackle particular questions and bring together teams of academic researchers. Now, these are small teams, 15 or 20 people, not the kind of teams that we see assembled here at the Summer Institute today, but small teams to tackle these questions. There were 8 initial programs, including economic fluctuations and growth, which Bob Hall was tapped to chair, productivity, which Zvi Grilicus was asked to lead. Bob Fogel led a group on economic history and development of the American economy. But these groups had a special focus typically, but they were going to meet several times a year and get researchers to interact, often with a common problem-solving focus. Okay? So the programs in some sense became a key part of the outreach that enabled the NBER to start working. And a key thing that Marty recognized, and I think the empirical legacy that he had worked on was critical here, was that individual researchers working on a data set or a question did not have that many people to talk to in their own departments about what they were doing. But if you could bring them together, right, the expertise on how do you process the current population survey amongst labor economists from 15 departments was actually a lot more productive than one labor economist in 15 departments talking to his or her colleagues. Right? So the idea was we'll take advantage of the increasing returns of bringing these researchers together, and that was critical to where Marty was going with the nature of the organization. Okay? And it remains in the fundamental DNA going forward. Second, Marty promoted the working paper series. Okay, now, many people think, just as many people think that Henry Ford invented the motor car, many people think that Marty Feldstein invented the working paper series. That is not true. There were, in fact, Robert Michael of the University of Chicago and other places was the person who launched the working paper series in 1973 to promote the work of the sort of health and social program that the NBER had at the time. There had been 173 working papers by the time that Marty started. Okay, and those of you who want to go shopping on eBay, right, the old vintage versions, the big yellow-covered NBER working papers with the white cutout in the middle, those are worth extra. Before they shrank to be only this size, and before they then disappeared completely and went digital. But those were the working paper series that were distributed. And Marty recognized that the working papers were a way to communicate new research findings on a broad scale to university libraries and then to the researchers in these various programs. So you didn't get all the working papers. You got the working papers in your program, and therefore you were basically getting the material that was most relevant for you. Marty also aggressively pushed to get the working papers out so that journalists could find access to the research and others. And this, by the way, was very controversial at the time because this was not peer-reviewed research, and it was very much not in the spirit of the NBER, which in the older days had often taken 4, 5, 6 years to carry out a project. The notion that work was now being distributed without the board of directors reviewing it first and in a way that provided comment and discussion was a fundamental change in the way the organization carried out activity. But that turned out to be really important. And of course, today we think of the working papers and other, and other similar institutions as key in providing information on how the science is progressing. But this was really the start of moving that forward in a very important way. Under Marty's watch, there were 14,155 working papers distributed, nearly 500 a year. And today, the NBER Working Paper Series is running at about 1,150 papers a year and is, of course, widely cited in many contexts. Third thing, Marty introduced the Summer Institute. Okay? It's an incredibly far step from the summer of 1978 when a group of about 50 researchers convened in Quincy House at Harvard in a small room with a large window-mounted air conditioner to keep them cool during the course of the hot days to discuss business taxation and finance and labor economics. Okay? And the summer of 1979 when a similar group in international trade and in macro convened. But the idea was that these researchers, typically drawn from these small programs, would come together and not spend 2 days, as most people do for their jam-packed meetings these days, but spend 3 weeks, 5 weeks, bring their families. The NBER would sometimes rent houses in Cambridge for people who were coming to the Summer Institute. It was a different time. It was a different spirit, but the idea was to facilitate this interaction, right? The interaction word again, because that was what people were going to do while they were at the Summer Institute working on these particular projects, okay? And of course, from that, the NBER grew to begin to have more span in terms of the number of activities, more scope in terms of the number of researchers involved, and ultimately less focus on specific questions and more of a kind of general gathering of what's going on today. Of course, today, it's actually substantially more difficult in most cases to get onto the program for the NBER Summer Institute than it is for the AEA meetings, and it's comparable to the difficulty of getting into some of the top journals in a number of the different fields. So, the NBER has evolved, the Summer Institute has evolved from there, but it's really kind of a key element of what happened. Finally, Marty reoriented the NBER's research program toward more active, immediate questions. Okay, so the NBER had a bit of a tradition of studying things like the labor share. Now, I know that today the labor share of income is a really important topic, and it's moved a lot. But in the time when the NBER studied it, it didn't move a lot for 50 years. But it was still worth studying. You can just tell if you do the regression discontinuity of topics studied before 77 and topics studied after 77, you can see the difference. I mean, Marty focused on questions like youth unemployment, the inflation. Okay, Bob Hall organized a conference on inflation and edited a book, taxation and capital formation, and also kind of did broader outreach thing. There's a volume called The American Economy in Transition, which brought together policymakers who had participated in policymaking during the 1970s with researchers to basically exchange ideas on how to think about these various elements. At the same time that Marty was refocusing the research program and trying to reach out to corporate and foundation sponsors, he also built a very robust infrastructure for grant administration at the NBER and encouraged researchers who were now affiliated with these programs to bring their sponsored research to the NBER, sort of fundamentally creating the tension between university-sponsored research offices and the NBER, which lasts to this very day, but managing to pull this off. Now, these transitions all happened in the first 2 years after Marty started at the NBER, right? If you just go back and look at what was happening in 1979, it was smaller, but it was very much in the model of what we see today. Now, this was not a smooth transition, okay? I think in retrospect, one just imagines that Marty had this vision and everyone said, whoa, what a great vision, let's just do it. Not true. First, all the people who got laid off were kind of annoyed, but there were those who thought that this was just moving too fast, and that the NBER had lost its moorings. And in fact, in 1979, the New York Times ran a story called Bull in a Data Shop, which was about the new NBER and whether or not this refashioning of the NBER was in fact something which was really going to be very successful going forward, or whether a venerable institution had in some sense gotten itself off on a siding that was really going to be a disaster. Of course, the time has told that this was a brilliant inspiration, and that all of the things that Marty did have actually borne amazing fruit, and really not just transformed the little parts of economics that were starting with those programs, but have transformed the way much more of the field of economics operates in the way we all do things. I think that it's easy for us from today's vantage point to see the contributions here, but it's interesting to ask, what made this work? Right? What was the secret sauce that enabled Marty to carry out this transformation and push it forward? And I think for those of us who know Marty and interacted with Marty, there are a couple of things that sort of stand out. One was that Marty had great taste in research questions. Marty really knew what was important and what wasn't. And he did not brook working on little tiny topics. He worked on big topics, and he encouraged others to do that. And that really is a key feature of the research activity under Marty's time at the helm. Second, Marty was a great judge of talent. Right? He was very good at finding particularly younger researchers who might be brought into the NBER and given leadership roles, and letting them basically run forward with the projects and the programs that he would help to launch. And third, Marty was a tireless worker. Anyone who interacted with Marty, you could never really tell when you got an email from Marty marked at 2:35 in the morning, whether it was because Marty was traveling the world and was in China and 12 hours away, or it was just Marty working at 2:35 in the morning, as he often did. But the energy level that Marty brought to the transformation of the NBER was enormous, and that was something which stayed with him through the entire 3 decades of the time that he did this. I am not going to try to offer you a quantitative estimate of how Marty's work at the NBER changed the course of economic science, but I am pretty sure that the answer is a lot, because the way in which he enabled the researchers to interact with each other bent the arc of progress within our field and enabled the fields of applied economics to jump forward faster than I think they would have in the absence of the changes he made.
I was in on the ground floor. Marty sought me out when he was thinking about what he was going to do if he became president. He had not committed himself when he first met with me. And he wondered if I would be interested in joining an effort to, as we would say in Silicon Valley, pivot the National Bureau, which a lot of people, I think, to be candid, felt was overdue. The idea of having a program with a program director obviously was central to his reason to be talking to me. And he outlined what that would involve, and he said, well, what do you think? Are you willing to do that? And I said, oh, yeah. And the secret of Marty in building this was the team that he built, whose instant reaction was, oh, yeah. It was a very appealing concept. It was very different from anything that I'd done before. Talked about this plan, and he outlined this idea that there'd be programs. There'd be a program in labor, IO, public economics, health economics, of course. And interestingly, and this I thought was completely ingenious from the start, 2 programs in macroeconomics. One that I was the candidate to run, and the other that Ben Friedman ended up running, called monetary policy. Well, monetary policy, of course, is completely intrinsic in every way. You can't have macro without monetary policy, or vice versa. But the overlap problem, and this came up over and over and over in my experiences with Marty, overlap, no problem. Don't let anyone complain about overlap. Don't build any boundaries. Someone's giving the same paper in 2 different programs. Well, that's all right, or maybe not, but it's not because of an overlap problem. There was evolution by subversion, subversion by me specifically. And the fact that Marty didn't just allow this to happen, it wasn't neglect. He liked the subversion. He really loved it. So, in particular, the Summer Institute originally, and the program itself, was a relatively small number of people. Many of the important ideas of macro, I'm very happy to say, were first listed and discussed within that group. But then I wanted to grow the group, and I did that in a number of ways that Marty eventually bought into, but represented subversion. For example, to expand the program, Marty had initially thought that people would need to be paid to be involved in the National Bureau. Of course, the sign of that relationship has completely changed. Now we could auction the right to be a research associate for a substantial amount of money, but fortunately we don't. And that amount of money was about $10,000 in today's dollars. It was really significant, and it was an important part of the budget that got the thing launched. And of course, that was probably important in launching it. But very quickly, I perceived that it was really unnecessary, and we could use the same money to bring people together to pay transport and hotel costs, which is the other big aspect of the Bureau's startup costs. And so I went there and said, Marty, I don't want my people to get $10,000 anymore. I want that money to be spent to expand the program. Done, he said. He was a very quick decision maker. This was I'll get back to you, that never ever occurred to him, which was quite wonderful for someone who was. Now you can see that program directors were given a huge amount of discretion. They were autonomous. They were subject not to prior review, which you'd think, but only by later review. Every program director met with Marty once a year at the Summer Institute, and we discussed what had been accomplished and what would be accomplished. But basically, as long as it looked good, whatever it was, as long as it looked good, then you just move forward. So it wasn't as if checking with headquarters was an important part of my job, and that was why subversion was so easy. But what I quickly discovered was that Marty's idea as an administrator was very straightforward. It was pick a very good group of people to help you and let them do their job. So that led to the creation of the Faculty Research Fellow, which I'm happy to say was my idea, which you couldn't imagine the Bureau today without FRFs. But there's still a lot of diversity, a lot of autonomy of program directors, which I think is just a superb thing. And a lot of differences in the way things are done. So it's really a fantastic contribution to build this organization. Marty was unquestionably the most successful academic administrator that I've ever worked with, and that's I forget, it's around 60 years now of involvement in academics. He really, really, really understood how to manage academics effectively. And delivered a better and better package for the amount of money put into it by taking advantage of the extreme enthusiasm for no pay. There was never any suggestion that you get paid for it. The only advantage was that you got to participate in this process. The result of this was that the Summer Institute in particular got better and better support from funders who were initially suspicious of the concentration in Cambridge, which was part of Marty's original model. Almost everybody in the original model came from Harvard. Not me, I was at MIT, untainted by Harvard. But then I moved to Stanford, which was just outrageous. But he swallowed that. He didn't say, no, you're fired, you have to be from Cambridge. He had just become a colleague of mine at Hoover, and his loss is a terrible thing as far as I'm concerned.
As a young, at the time, assistant professor, or maybe I was already associate professor at the University of Chicago, I really wanted to be Marty's colleague. I was appointed to be part of the recruiting committee of the University of Chicago. We are now in the mid-70s. And we needed somebody in public finance, so it was called at the time. And I put Marty's name forward. There was a faculty meeting, and I was shocked to see In a group of people, if you know the University of Chicago at the time, two individuals could never agree about what's the time. So you're sitting in the room with Al Harberger, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Harry Johnson, Bob Fogel, Mert Miller, who came from the business school, and Gene Fama, and complete unanimity. Marty is our guy. Later on, I understood that there was another plan. And as you described now how the NBER evolved and came to Cambridge, let me tell you, there was a plan to bring it to Chicago at the time. And we wined him and dined him, and people felt that it was going somewhere, because his economics was much more, quote, Chicago-type economics. You believe in incentives and all of these kind of things. And he never said no until he came back home. And then Al Harberger, who was the chairman of the department, called me, said, Jacob, we blew it. Rather than bringing Marty, we should have brought Kate. So Marty stayed in Harvard. The NBER did not come to Chicago. It was a good plan. And I was devastated. So Marty was very nice. And he said, I'll tell you what. We will have a program. We'll call it a visitors program, and you will come to Harvard and be sometime there as the first visitor of the new NBER program. And I accepted, and we became very, very good friends. And Marty was very, very dedicated to his students. The second week I was sitting in Mass Avenue, he said to me, you know what? You did not get me, but at least you can get my students. Let me introduce you to my very best student. And he called in a young man called Larry Summers. And, well, didn't work out either. I remember the words that were mentioned in that faculty meeting. And it's important because it tells you the type of people who were in the room. And it was a compliment. He is the most serious back-of-the-envelope economist. And it was viewed as an extraordinary compliment. Somebody who has great intuition, knows what is the minimal number of data that you need to look at, and see the forest through the mess. And indeed, this is what Marty has been. But open economy, macroeconomics, this was something which Marty really liked, and he said, I want to make it an international program. With the passage of time, those of you who know how the NBER expanded internationally with joint programs, and whether it is India, and with him, many of us went to China, with him, many of us went to Russia, things that could not have been thought earlier. The Summer Institute, as was just described, was ahead of its time. Today, many of the universities, as you design them, you see the value of multidisciplinary organizations. And this was really the concept. Questions that were never discussed in such an explicit programmatic way. Long-term trends in public finance, health economics, pension systems, social security, unemployment insurance, minimum wage, and all those kind of things were becoming bread and butter. But not as a dogmatic ideological thing, but rather as a way in which one assesses how the incentive system works. And this was really Marty. Incentives. Now, who was Marty? Some of you think that Marty was a very conservative, not only economist, but also a conservative guy. And it is right. Did you ever see him without a jacket? Did you ever see him with jeans or shorts? You didn't. But yet, he was, in a way, also adventurer. He was adventurer when we went together to the Iguazu Falls. You remember, Kate? Wow, this was something. We went from Argentina to Brazil, and there was a storm. The plane had to go back. It was not allowed to land. And I said, let's give it up. He said, no, we have to go back. He convinced the pilot to take off and go and try again this dangerous landing, which I would have never done again. In March, it is always China Development Forum. And the China Development Forum is a big forum where Marty again carried the day with great prestige. Anyone who wanted to understand the US economy or the world listened to it. But for him, what was important is the evening that we went to the Grand Hyatt Hotel, to the restaurant called Made in China, the best Peking duck in the world. He could never give it up. In October, always the International Council of JPMorgan, which he really loved. And then, of course, his Washington experience showed a very different dimension of Marty, a dimension that shows that you can be soft-spoken, but with extraordinary spine, backbone when it comes to critical issues. Just those of you who remember the days and the silly debates about do budget deficits matter and maybe they do not, and this kind of a discussion, and Marty stood firm, whether it was not against, vis-a-vis Don Reagan, Jim Baker, even the president, Larry Speaks, the White House spokesman, all of those who were really fighting him, and he stood his own, so much so that when he left, the way in which he was described as the man whose reputation was proven to be impeccable. And this was Senator Moynihan at his departure. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, this gathering is exactly, Jim, what Marty would have liked to have. What is the most fitting? A gathering in the NBER, in the context of the Summer Institute, of research people, Harvard, family, friends. This is the true Marty, the true legacy, and that legacy is immortal. And through that also is our dear friend Marty.
Marty Feldstein came to Oxford a year before I did, and a year later went to Nuffield College, and then I followed him to Nuffield College. And we were quite close during that period at Oxford, and then continued that friendship for the rest of our lives. And that had a great influence on me personally, and on, as it turned out, the development of economics in Europe. Because Marty, when he took over the NBER, that was a takeover of a rather sleepy research institute, an in-house research institute, a think tank, as we would call it. And he transformed it into a network of economists all over the US and some from abroad. And that model turned out to be very appealing. It was not just things like the Summer Institute and the Working Paper series. It was the web of network of interconnections among scholars that turned out to make a huge difference to the development of our profession. I saw that sitting over in England, where I stayed, and it was an inspiration for the creation of the Center for Economic Policy Research, which was also conceived of as a network of economists. And in Europe, this was perhaps even more important than in the United States, because the separation, the national separations, meant that people really didn't work together very much. The NBER model, first starting with the Summer Institute and the interconnections that developed there, and then subsequently in all sorts of projects and working groups and conferences and so forth, that was a tremendous stimulus to the development of best practice economics. And it was in Europe too, it turned out. The CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research, following that model, with some changes, of course, to adapt to local conditions, we constructed what we called subsequently a think net rather than a think tank. And it was for the United States, it was a big change. The National Bureau of Economic Research was an old, well-established think tank research institute, but it was rather sleepy. And I think its board of directors probably didn't realize what Marty had in mind when they appointed him to run it. And the subsequent change was dramatic and had very far-reaching effects. So as we look at NBER today, that vision of bringing scholars together in a wide variety of manners, that vision has proved tremendously important in the US, but also in a somewhat modified form in Europe. And I think that is a legacy that's very important. I'm grateful to Marty on a personal level, but I think the profession in Europe, as much as in the United States, has a lot to be grateful for from the innovations that he brought to our activities.
I've had many friends, many colleagues, and many teachers. None have had as large an influence through what they taught me and through their example as Marty Feldstein. I met Marty when I was 18 and even more disheveled then today, when my father detected that I didn't have a plan for the summer and was interested in economics, and asked Marty if he would give me a job for the summer, which was very kind of Marty to do. Although I must say that I think my father may have slightly overestimated his kindness, because my father didn't appreciate just how diversified Marty's portfolio of research assistants was that summer, what with there being 18 of them. And so he was relatively hedged against what transpired, which was my proving to be incompetent. I remember sitting in his office and bringing some regression results, and Marty saying to me, and this was the first thing he taught me, before we look at the regression results, why don't we just kind of look at the data and how it's aligned? And he said, Larry, how likely do you think it is that total spending on Social Security in Belgium is 3 times as large as total Social Security spending in the United States? And I said, well, you know, they have very generous social insurance in Belgium. And he just looked at me. But he persevered with letting me work for him, or at least be in his presence. And I learned a lot. Lesson 1, persist. You know, they say that deeds matter more than words. I remember sitting in a place that most of the people in this room never know existed, 1737 Cambridge Street on the 6th floor. I shared an office with Alan Auerbach and David Elwood and Dan Frisch, and the office had one of those old computer terminals with a continuous flow of paper. And the paper stopped flowing. It didn't continue to feed through right. And that meant that Marty's regressions on the 4 projects we were working on were in danger of making no progress between 1:30 and 5 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. We reported this to Marty. I think we had mixed feelings. It was a nice day out. And Marty came up, and Marty's known for many things, but nobody has referred to his great mechanical prowess. And he looked at the thing, and he found a rubber band, and he kludged the rubber band around various parts of the computer terminal, and all of a sudden the paper fed. And Marty smiled and said, I guess you guys can continue on the projects. And there was nothing that Marty knew by virtue of being a full professor at Harvard rather than a graduate student that enabled him to figure out how to make that computer terminal work, except he really cared about what he was doing, and that caused him to not recognize obstacles as real. Second thing I learned from Marty, I remember it because at the time it made a real impression on me. I learned that it matters much more what you're for than what you're against. A few years into the Bureau, we were having a conversation. Marty and I were having a conversation about one thing or another. And at that time, the NBER had a working paper series and a technical working paper series. And there was some paper that somebody or other had written. I don't suppose this was literally its title, but it conveys the flavor. Maximum likelihood estimation on a torus. And I asked Marty, I said, Marty, how come this is a regular working paper, not a technical working paper? If there's ever a point in having a technical working paper, I would have thought it was maximum likelihood estimation on a torus. And Marty said, you're obviously right, but if I said it had to be on a torus, the guy would be unhappy, his friends would be unhappy, the paper would get disseminated a little less, and people would be mad, and why? I'd rather spend my energy starting things than stopping things, encouraging things than discouraging things. It's a good lesson. Haven't always remembered it. It's basic. You guys weren't supposed to laugh that much. You really weren't. Third lesson I learned, sort of watching Marty, but it was also things that he said, was it's probably best to have a great and new question and a great and entirely compelling answer to that question. But the opportunity to have that is certainly not going to present itself 16 times a year, and Marty was going to write 16 papers a year. So what I learned was if you had to compromise, it was better to have a great question that people hadn't thought about before than to have a somewhat improved answer to a question that 20 people had already worked on trying to answer. Fourth thing I learned was new data, newly constructed and created variables, and competence beat old data being processed for the 1,000th time with brilliance. Marty understood the importance of informal interaction. He understood it as a way of driving progress, and he understood it as a way of drawing people in. And that's why he has forged what is actually economics' most powerful research instrument. Not a supercomputer, not an econometric technique, but the network that is the institution that we are part of today. It's a remarkable legacy to the world, and it's a remarkable legacy for the people like me whose lives he transformed. Thank you, Marty.
I got to know Marty in many different roles. He was my undergraduate teacher. Indeed, I took my very first class, Economics 10, from Marty, on the first day he taught Economics 10. I also attended the last Economics 10 lecture given by Marty. I think I may be the only one who bridged the two. I knew him as the leader of the NBER when I was a research assistant here as an undergraduate and also as a graduate student. He was my colleague at Harvard for 13 years, where we co-taught both undergraduate and graduate public economics. He was my co-advisor on many dissertations, and he was my highly esteemed boss once I became a program director at the NBER. Marty was an economist of breathtaking insight and extraordinary breadth. I cannot tell you how much I love teaching his papers today when I teach public economics. It's just my favorite thing to do. He had the ability to break through any issue and see its first-order truths. He usually would write the seminal paper on a topic, and then he might actually let the topic go so that other people could write the downstream papers. He was an incredibly dedicated teacher, and anyone who co-taught with him would know how true that was. He just always had time for students. He always took students seriously, and he really wanted students to understand. He was a colleague and a mentor beyond compare. He was a person of the greatest integrity. I would say he was the person of the greatest integrity whom I knew. Cared very deeply about nurturing each coming generation of economists. And his way of doing this was making the NBER a sort of incubator for young economists, a place where undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, and especially junior faculty could see the latest research, present their work in progress, often at an early stage, interact informally with other economists, and brainstorm over coffee or during the breaks in the conferences. He very deliberately created a culture in which young people who were eager to do good work would feel welcome and would feel that they were taken seriously. That Marty had an absolutely incredible ability to focus on any promising student, giving us the same attention he would give a peer of his own seniority. I mean, if you ran into him in the kitchen and pitched an idea to him, he would sit down with you and take it seriously, even if you were just a student. Remarkably, Marty always made us feel that we were part of the NBER and that we could ask for anything in the furtherance of economic research, advice, data, statistical software, space, or computing, anything. He made the NBER a home from home for generations of young economists, many of whom came up with at least one of their most important paper ideas while sitting around the kitchen table and chatting. By the by, Marty was the genius behind the idea that providing breakfast, specifically donuts, was the way to get sleepy graduate students out of bed and at their desks early in the morning. There's now some protein on the menu. Most economists here were first exposed to the NBER at a conference where we as young people could get swept up in the latest research debates, see top economists questioning one another, sometimes fiercely, and find ourselves participating in heady conversations with senior people who never seemed to question why we were there or whether we were sufficiently serious. And probably everyone here has had multiple aha moments at an NBER conference. Some such moments are transformative. Several of my program members this week have told me that if it were not for the sense of community, the ability to start collaborations, and the feedback that they enjoyed at NBER conferences, they would never have become economists. It was under Marty that the NBER started the Economics of Education program, and I was fortunate enough to work with him on starting it. He loved economics so much that he wanted to create any program that he thought would expand the degree to which economic analysis could solve problems. I'm sure that my experience was not unique to my program. It started with his vision that he could see that education, the field of education, really required serious and concentrated analysis, and that education was ripe for research that would not occur so long as it was a mere subfield of some of the other fields of economics, especially labor economics and public economics. I agreed with him on this strongly. He worked with me to recruit scholars. He demonstrated to me how to engage funders. He helped me to convene our first conferences, and he himself took part in those conferences, in part, I think, to ensure the participation of other top scholars. And then he launched us on our way. The program is now thriving so much and is so large that it's really kind of hard to believe that it started with such a small germ. And the germ was important conversations that Marty and I had about how the analysis of education could be changed by bringing in more economic theory, by understanding that schools and universities are really organizations that we ought to understand more in the same way we understand firms, that there ought to be more public finance in school finance, and so on. I had many very exciting and important conversations with Marty. But more importantly, I believe that all of the programs thrived and grew under Marty precisely because of the NBER's culture of nurturing younger scholars. I trace to Marty my strong belief that the most important role of each program is to ensure that younger scholars have opportunities to present their research, get feedback, and perhaps most importantly, interact with other scholars. Many fairly senior scholars, including myself, would say that they most look forward to giving a paper at the NBER. It's better than giving a paper anyplace else. Why? Because it is the venue in which you're going to get the feedback that will allow you to make the most important changes to your research. But Marty's legacy, I hope, is that the same that I just said of myself can be said twice or three times as strongly and fervently by younger scholars. Through his mentoring and the environment he created, he has many offspring in this room, his children in economics, as it were, and his grandchildren, and his great-nieces, and his great-nephews, and the great-greats. This is indeed his NBER family. I will miss him a great deal.
I emailed several professors in my first week as a freshman at Harvard in 1997 to inquire about research assistant positions. And Marty was one of a handful of professors who replied. With many of the other professors, I only got to meet their graduate students. But to my amazement, I was sitting in Marty's NBER office within a few days of sending that email talking about research. The conversation seemed to go well, and at the end, I recall Marty asking me whether I'd be interested in helping him with some of his projects in public finance. And I remember replying, saying, that sounds really interesting, that sounds great, but what exactly is public finance? That was the first of many questions he kindly answered over the years. And what struck me then was something I truly appreciated about Marty over time. He could go from talking with the President of the United States to a first-year student at the college and educate them both while making them feel valued and respected. I worked with Marty as a research assistant at the NBER for about 3 months, at which point I then vividly recall a meeting in which Marty said, "You have a lot of ideas of your own. I think you should pursue them and we should continue our conversations rather than working on my specific projects." I came out of that meeting thinking that either that might be a polite way to say that my RA work wasn't quite up to par, or maybe that was a good sign of Marty's confidence in me. I ended up sitting at the NBER talking with Marty regularly for the next couple of years, a period that really cemented my interest in research in economics. I went on to graduate school at Harvard, where Marty was my advisor, and continued to work at the NBER. While I didn't fully recognize it at the time, the environment Marty created at the NBER for empirical economics had an incredible influence that extended well beyond direct conversations with Marty himself. I sat on the 4th floor next to Matt Genskow, Jesse Shapiro, and a number of others who would go on to become some of the leading economists of this generation. At the time, I was more interested in pursuing economic theory, but gradually became more interested in empirical work, in particular by talking with Jesse Shapiro and seeing his work with Ed Glazer develop over those years. In this context, I began to appreciate how Marty's influence extended well beyond his direct work to the institutions he built that would have lasting impact. Like most others in public economics, when I was a grad student, I read and sought to emulate Marty's papers. One paper that I think captures Marty's style particularly well is his 1999 paper on the taxable income elasticity as a measure of the deadweight loss of the income tax system, which everybody here in the public economics group will know very well. That paper's approach now underpins much of the field of tax policy by proposing a very general yet eminently practical method to study how taxes affect the economy. It's general in the sense that it's predicated on very few untestable assumptions, unlike many economic methods. It's practical because it can actually be implemented with the data that we have, that is information directly from tax returns. Marty's insight in that paper later became known as the sufficient statistic approach to optimal policy and is a method that's now widely used in many fields of economics. But beyond its scientific impact, and the reason I'm mentioning it here, is that I think it captures a style of work that's had a deep influence on me and on many others, trying to do rigorous work on important policy questions that's transparent and grounded in data as much as possible, which I really think is the hallmark of improving economic and social welfare through economic science, which I see as the central mission of the NBER, as Marty laid it out and as we're all trying to carry it out today. Going beyond graduate school, as I became a professor at Berkeley and later returned to Harvard, I continued to learn from Marty, both at the NBER and elsewhere. The NBER Public Economics Network really became my central professional network with numerous collaborators and friends. In fact, my entire schedule and our research team's entire schedule became organized and is still completely organized around the NBER calendar, with presentations at the Summer Institute as the goal to which we're working at other points of the year. So our students know this very well because I think they're all looking forward to some additional sleep at the end of this week after they've been pushing really hard for presentations we gave this week here. So today, I continue to aspire to follow Marty's example in organizing my own work, from trying to do empirically grounded science that speaks to policy questions, to creating institutions that provide public goods like the NBER, to introducing more students to the beauty of economics and social science in introductory courses at Harvard. And most importantly, to try to do all of these things in a way that respects and includes everyone, no matter their background, no matter their status. A few weeks ago, I was in my office at Harvard, and a freshman came into my office and said that he had read that I began in economics by working with Marty Feldstein as a research assistant, as a freshman myself. He asked if I'd take him under my wing in the same way, which I gladly agreed to do. I often think back to that first email response I got from Marty in 1997 as the pivotal moment that shaped my career and my life. I'm sad that I won't see Marty in the halls of Littauer and the NBER, but I'm comforted knowing that his spirit and influence will carry on in all of us for the generations to come. Thanks so much.